If I could, before we get underway, I would like to promote things that the Watt Center has for sale. We have the 2024 calendar, $10 a piece. We have this year's calendar, and it is by donation, so keep that in mind. We have John Wilson Laughlin's Civil War memoir. This is a very interesting read. Joel and Shelley, there's 2 more up here. You can come right on up. History of Barnesville. This is the Tanny Hill, which is very early Barnesville history. This is one of my favorites, Barnesville's 200 years. And on the back, I see someone familiar.
Yes, there are 4 of us.
We have Marie, Bruce, me, and Jean Davies. All of us are in the room tonight, I believe. That's pretty
And that's already been...
This lovely one. This is the centennial that we reprinted. It was long out of print, and it is fascinating. Lots of pictures of Barnesville houses and businesses. One of my favorites, it's a picture book, just like this is a really good picture book. And last but not least, The Story of Barnesville, Dr. Shepard's book, larger print, easier to read. So afterwards, we'll have all of these for sale. And now, without further ado, my good friend Bruce Yarnall is going to share 215 plus years of history.
Yes, slightly more than that. But anyway, as a longtime member of the Watt Center, however, from a long distance, a lot of the commercial stuff that's downstairs, I donated back in 1995 or 1996. Every time I come home, somebody's saying, hey, we'll give you this or we'll give you that. And I already have 2.5 boxes to go back with me that I need to sort through. But one of the packages that came to me yesterday following church was this box, which is a suit box, which is Foster's store, which was on West Main Street. And it's probably late 1930s, looking at so anyway, that one's staying in Barnesville because it's fragile enough, but I had to get the weight out of it. So if you have stuff that you would like to donate, by all means, Eric Sidwell or anyone else here at the Watt Center. So I'm going to try to carry you through this history, and I'll try not to bore you too much. I won't keep you past 11 o'clock tonight. If we do, we're into the next day then. But anyway, this is a bird's eye view of Barnesville taken in 1899, and they were done for towns and cities all over the country. But when I first gave this talk at the Chamber of Commerce dinner back in March, I talked about talking to my cousin, Crystal Lorimore, who's the Belmont County CIC director. And we were trying to figure out, well, what made Barnesville different and unique from a lot of other communities? And we decided that there were 2 things. One was its Quaker background, and the other was farming. And why those 2 things? Well, Quakers always have to arrive at consensus, or try to. That didn't always occur. And farming, you have to work with each other, especially not so much today, but certainly in earlier times, to make things happen. So as we move forward this evening and we're talking about some of the things that have happened here in Barnesville, think about that those are 2 common themes. I have lived in Washington, D.C. area since the year 2000, and every time I come to Barnesville, I come through Barnesville to go to Barnesville. This is the exit for Barnesville, Maryland, and it's just a very little small community in the agricultural area of Montgomery County. And it was founded in 1796 by James Barnes. And James Barnes and his wife, he was a shoemaker, and he was also had a grist mill there. And his wife was Nancy Harrison Barnes. But they didn't stay in Barnesville very long. They came to Barnesville, Ohio. But before they got to Barnesville, Ohio, or anybody else of the European settlers, however, there were the indigenous people. And many people say that this is by the Adena people from over 1,000 years ago, but this is Track Rocks, which is located west of Barnesville. There were over 100 inscriptions or carvings in these stones, including what looks to be like an elephant, but it's probably some other thing. There looks like a turtle. There are stretching skins, animal skins. There's an eye, et cetera, et cetera. And Gene Davies and I met with R&F Coal Company probably 40 years ago over in St. Clairsville, because this was scheduled to be strip mined, and we talked them out of that. Eventually it ended up in the hands of Consol, and since 2000, this has been in the hands of the architectural, not an architectural, but an archaeological conservancy, and they now protect it. Brock Rogers of the Barnesville, Belmont County Historical Society Mansion Museum, they had a tour out there this summer. I think you had close to 75 or 100 people that showed up. So anyway, that's the earliest folks here. And then, of course, when the white man arrived, most folks came here certainly after 1800. If you want to know what it was like here before settlement, go to Dysert's Woods. Dysert's Woods, which was recently donated by the Ohio University to the Captina Conservancy, shows you what it was like here. And the first family to get to Barnesville was a Quaker family from Maryland, and that was Robert Plummer. And this is the Plummer House west or east of Barnesville that's now owned by the Ohio Yearly Meeting, and Marie Bundy has been helping care for that property here in recent years. It was also an inn on the Drovers Road, and the Drovers Road was kind of a competitor to the National Road, where you had to pay tolls, but on the Drovers Road you didn't. And it went from Pulteney, which is south of Bel Air, which was actually the first Belmont County court, where the Belmont County Courthouse was located, west to just near Old Washington. But folks also went on the Drovers Road, and when I was in Barnesville for the Victorian Village Project, I did a trunk tour of the elementary school, and I was telling the children about the fact that when Robert Plummer came here, it took 4 days to cut through the timber to get their wagon from Morristown, Zane's Trace, to this farm. And this one little kid, he raised his hand, he says, "Mr. Yarnall?" I said, "Yes." He says, "Well, why didn't they just use a bulldozer?" So that was kind of funny. And anyway, in 1808, James and Nancy, they're going to migrate to Ohio, and he buys this land that's now Barnesville, Ohio, but he doesn't move here immediately. He gets the first resident to come here, who is Reverend James Rounds, a Methodist minister, and he settles on the lot, which is now the corner pharmacy, and he also has a tan yard where they take hides and they tan them. Well, when the village decided to tear down the row building here a couple of years ago, and more about that later, these pits were discovered, and they contacted me with the photos, and they said, "Do you have any idea what this is?" Yes, I knew exactly what it was. Unfortunately, it wasn't documented by the Ohio Historical Society. They didn't bother checking with them, but these were the 1808 pits. They also found this piece here, and so that was the first industry in Barnesville, and he was the first citizen. James Barnes and Nancy didn't come here until 1812, is actually when they moved into Barnesville. So who were the first settlers? The white settlers here were the Quakers. And Quakers were having problems with slavery. And as a group, they were, especially the Southern Quakers, they were deciding that this just wasn't the right thing to do, so they wanted to free their slaves. And they also wanted to get out of the slaveholding areas. The Northwest Territory, which was established in 1788, was the first governmental unit in the entire history of the world that said there shall be no slavery here. So in 1799, a group of Quakers in North Carolina sent scouts north to check this area out, and they ended up in the area of Coleraine, Ohio. And they went back and they said, "Yes, this is good land," and they decided to move here. So they moved here. They started moving in 1800. By 1826, there were over 9,000 Quakers in Belmont, Jefferson counties primarily, and also some in Harrison, Guernsey, and Monroe. But there were 9,000 Quakers in this area. Another early group that moved to Barnes, and Barnesville's unique in Belmont County, and we'll get into that later with the Quaker connections. Another early group was the Catholics, and Temperanceville, St. Mary's, is the second oldest parish in the entire state of Ohio. Somerset in Perry County is the oldest, 1811. Temperanceville, which was then called Beaver, was 1819 to 1822, roughly. But anyway, we got a few photos here. Temperanceville, a lot of nuns came from Temperanceville, a lot of priests came from Temperanceville, and that photo right there is of Nicholas Gallagher. He was born in the stone house opposite the church in 1846. He went to Columbus, he became a priest. He was the first American-born bishop at the Diocese of Galveston, and he was bishop during the Great Hurricane of 1900. And the other guy there is Edward Creighton, and he was born near Temperanceville, but he left here. He didn't stay here long. He went to Dayton, and from Dayton to Nebraska. And he was a successful businessman, but a devout Catholic, and he and his wife gave the money to form a college basketball powerhouse, Creighton University. So it's named for him. Now, let me just also say, and that book right there, Laura Lee Porter and Pearl Rashman worked on that book. It's up at the library. It's a great book. It tells you the whole history of the parish. Catholics were not looked upon well by the Protestants. Just the truth of it. I mean, in the 1850s, it was the Know-Nothing Party, and they were anti-immigrant. What goes on today went on before. If you want to know history, it just repeats itself. The Catholics eventually left, or migrated. A lot of them migrated to Barnesville. Well, the parish in Barnesville ended up. It was started where where the Catholic cemetery is. That's where they got their start. They bought the land for the cemetery in 1871. The church wasn't established until 1891. Why were the Catholics down there at that location? Well, it was actually outside of the corporation limits at the time. So, written or unwritten, these things go on. Another group that it's unique to this area are the African Americans. And this is Captina, or Captina, as some people say. But I found in 1858 when the Ohio the folks trying to get folks to move back to Liberia came here, they called it Guinea. So we know that it was Guinea, but it was established, the church was established there in 1824 in a grove that still exists just north of the old Howells Airport. The church, the AME church, wasn't founded until 1816, so that's only 8 years later. Now, why was the church formed? Why was the AME church formed? Because the whites would not allow the blacks to be seated on the main floor. And if you want to see a church building today that exemplifies this, go to Center Wheeling, go to St. Alphonsus Church, and the balcony that's up in the back is where the blacks were seated before the end of slavery. But why did they come to Ohio? Well, we just said slavery wasn't allowed here. But here's some other reasons. One of the ones that was recorded in the Guernsey County history book by Wolfe, who was a historian in 1938, 1939, talks about Silky Turner, Silky Wooten Turner. She was freed by her master upon the death of his wife, and she came here. She was manumitted. She took her papers and she fled. Well, why did she flee Virginia? Because in 1806, Virginia passed a law that if you were freed, you had 1 year to get out of the state. Because they didn't want free people around the slaves, because that would make the slaves think that perhaps that was something that they would be interested in as well. But before we get too high and mighty and think, well, Ohio was, this was a great place for everybody, let me give you some information regarding the Ohio laws, the black laws passed between 1804 and 1838. If you were going to reside in the state of Ohio, you had to secure employment. You had to post a bond of $500 signed by 2 white people, ensuring that you were of good character. Blacks were permitted from attending schools, performing military duty, jury duty, and testifying against whites. Now, a lot of these laws just simply weren't enforced because this was more of an anti-slavery area. Guinea, Captina was on the Underground Railroad, and that's the tombstone of Sandy L. Alexander Harper, who is buried there, and he was the Underground Railroad conductor there. And there were Underground Railroad conductors in Somerton, Quaker City, Barnesville, etc. That book there was written by Henry Burke, who was a historian friend of mine from Marietta, and it's a fictionalized story, but it goes through the escaping slaves go through Captina and on up. And in 2002, during the Ohio Bicentennial roll-up, we did that marker, which the state of Ohio put up. So there is a marker there because the church is gone and the area is gone as well. So what was one of the early cash tobacco or crops? It was tobacco. And the story, as the story is repeated, James Price, who was a minister who migrated here, began that production in 1819. And it was a good cash crop. The ground was fertile, but tobacco also stripped a lot of the nutrients out of the ground, and that was another difficult problem. It was grown, it would be dried, and then it was taken to the packing house. James Barnes had a packing house. There were several packing houses in Barnesville. They were loaded into hogsheads, and if you want to know what a hogshead is, go over here to the depot and look at that wooden thing that's there next to the cigar. That would hold 900 pounds of tobacco, and they would pack it up and they would send it to the market in Baltimore. Well, before the railroad arrived, that had to go by wagon over the National Road, or the Zanes Trace and the National Road. They could put maybe 3 on each wagon, and then they would haul it off. So that was really the first cash crop here. And that really played out in this country, or this area, for almost a full century. So in the early 1840s, that's photo up in the far corner. That's Isaac Barnes. He was the first mayor of Barnesville in 1835, 1836, son of James Barnes. The original painting for that is hanging in the municipal building. The house next to him that looks like a house in a store, that's actually the Barnes store that was located where First National Bank and now Ohio Hills Health Service is located. And also, I'm going to show you 2 other houses. That house in the lower corner, on the far corner, was the Reed Mansion, and they had several industries here in town, and that was located here until 1968 when it was torn down. And the building in the middle is still there temporarily because that's the former site of Foster's and half of what was Harp's Restaurant, and then later Patrick's, which is slated to be torn down by the new owner. Now, James Barnes still owned land back in Maryland. So he went back to Maryland, and in 1843, he went to Maryland to take care of business, and he was returning by stagecoach. He was 75 years old, he got sick, and he died in Grantsville. So every time I come over Route 68 and I go through Grantsville, I think of James Barnes. He was buried there. 1939, 1936 through 1939, we had several events here in Barnesville called the Pioneer Days. So they dug him up and they brought him back here and buried him in Southern Cemetery. So they think. And when I used to do tours, I'd tell folks, well, did they or didn't they? Or on the Day of Judgment, will somebody else wake up in Barnesville and say, where am I? We don't know. So, Barnesville in 1818 thought they could become a county seat. Everybody wanted to become a county seat. Well, people still, you can see why, because there's a lot of commerce there. So they were going to do it. They did a survey, they did a petition to the state, and they wanted to become a new county seat. And the reason was the distance between St. Clairsville and Cambridge. And it is quite some distance. Yeah. St. Clairsville is 12 miles from the river, but when St. Clairsville was selected as the Belmont County seat, they renamed Newellstown St. Clairsville in honor of Territorial Governor James St. Clair, and they showed it on the map as being further west than it actually is. Later, Belmont changed their name from Wrightstown to Belmont, thinking they were going to get a county seat as well. But anyway, we did the petition, nothing happened. In 1847, it happened again. But in 1847, 1851, another county was actually formed, and that's Noble County, which is just to the west and south of us, including Batesville area. And Noble County was not named for the hills. It was named for a state legislature that they influenced to allow them to become a county. So, politics in the 1840s is no different than the politics today. So, anyway, then what changed for Barnesville was the arrival of the railroad. James Barnes, they claimed, said because he didn't get the national road through here, that someday the iron rail and the railroad in the 1820s already they knew about it. So in 1854, the Central Ohio Railroad came. It was from Newark to Bel Air. It was headquartered in Newark, but it went from Columbus to Bel Air. And it came into Barnesville in 1854 in August. And the steepest grade was the Barnesville grade here, Barnesville Hill. Yeah, and it was always a problem. But the company struggled, and it was beginning in 1866. It was managed by the B&O Railroad and eventually went under. And when it went under, then it became part of the B&O system. The depot was originally located down what was later Pompco and is now Village Hardware. And that they found out that grade didn't work, so they moved it over to where it is now, and that's where it was for the rest of the time. In 1872, the Barnesville Tunnel was built. Before that, it was just an open cut. And of course, they built buildings on top of that. All of those buildings are not there anymore, but anyway, that's how the Barnesville Tunnel came along. So it's a man-made tunnel. It's not dug up. Then, along comes the Civil War. That guy there is John Hunt Morgan. He supposedly came through Barnesville and stopped at the Parker House west of town because he would bring cattle through here on the Drovers Road. So they claimed that he knew the area. But he was a cavalry general in the South, and of course he decided they were going to raid the North. They were going to show them what's going on. This is what is today Old Washington, where the skirmish occurred, and 4 Confederate soldiers were killed, and they're buried there in the cemetery in Old Washington. At Campbell Station, which is Lower City today, they burnt down the tobacco warehouse and a few other things. But they thought they were going to come to Barnesville because the wooden trestle at Bailey's Mills, because he could then put the railroad out of business. Okay, so everyone thought, well, let's see what happens here, and so they went down to protect the trestle, and it was called Camp Trestle. All of them were volunteers. But as a result of all of this, there were 4 companies formed only here and in the state of Ohio. 1 in Henrysburg, 1 in Somerton, and 2 in Barnesville. They were called Departmental Corps. So they were home guards. So they were going to be ready for the next time that something came up. And this is a photograph that George Chaffee found for us. This is where the municipal building is today, and that's one of the companies from Barnesville. They're practicing, getting ready to protect the thing. Over there is a letter that's in my possession that I bought on eBay from the Provost Marshal of who was David McCartney for the entire congressional district, and he is the one who directed the men to go down there. And of course, they were telegraphing back and forth, and they thought they were actually talking with Morgan, but they weren't quite sure of it. And where was Provost Marshal's office? It was on the 2nd story of a building that the village just recently tore down, unfortunately, on West Main Street. So it was up on the 2nd floor, and more about this building later when we talk about the post office. But that's where his office was located, in that building right there that predated the Civil War. So the other thing that happened, and shortly after all of this was, then they decided that they were going to, they needed to get the troops from the eastern flank to the west. So in September of 1863, the largest domestic movement of American troops in U.S. history on American ground occurred when 25,000 men were transferred from the Eastern Theater to the Western Theater, and they went through Barnesville. Okay? They went through here now, they crossed the Ohio River on boat because the viaduct, the bridge that's down there now, it wasn't built until 1872. But that's the largest movement of American soldiers in history, and it literally went through this community. So after the Civil War, then Barnesville decided to get back into its agricultural business. The first jerseys west of the Allegheny Mountains were in Barnesville. And James and Edgerton and his wife brought them here. And these are from a couple of our calendars that we put out over the years. And of course, that is a cow down there taken a few years ago by Journey's Inn Farm, which was the farm of out here off of Warren Avenue. And L.P. Bailey of Tacoma, Ohio, whose ad is over there. If you've heard of the Bailey Farm, he and his wife, I mean, they won awards at World's Fairs and all kinds of places. But Barnesville was known as and for many, many years, up through the 1930s, there was a Belmont County Jersey Cattle Club, had a show here every year at the Rogers Farm out at Spidell. And I mean, it was big business. Eventually, milk, that was highly prized for butter and cream. And, you know, then we got away from that. But anyway, that was the jerseys, the first jerseys west of the Alleghenies was here in Barnesville, Ohio. Barnesville was also the strawberry capital of the world. So a lot of the Quaker families especially raised strawberries. And I mean, that's a short crop every year. But this is and of course what made it possible were the refrigerated cars with ice in them on the B&O Railroad, so they could ship them from here to Baltimore and Washington and Chicago. And that, of course, is a young lady with her little hod carrying that. This is down at the Barnesville Depot, and these are some of the workers, and there are the berry baskets there, you can see them. And that's Isaac P. Lane, whose house was located on South Lincoln Avenue, down the street from you, unfortunately, Jake, it's now gone. And he was the station agent here at Barnesville. So Barnesville was the strawberry capital of the world. Well, we also got an industry. In 1862, James Watt came here from the great town of Malaga, Ohio, in Monroe County. And he made some money here, believe it or not. So they started Watt Foundry up in a building that is on where the city fire station is now. And in 1891, they moved to the current area where we are. And there you can see where we are at the present time. There's part of the house that we're in. And Governor McKinley, who later became President McKinley, dedicated this factory in 1891. He came here, and it was at one time the largest rail car manufacturing factory in the world, concern in the world. This photo I bought recently this past year on eBay. Dave Adair, who's here with us from Cambridge, dated it, and I forget the exact date, but I'm thinking maybe 1915 or something like that. But that's out here, there's the factory in the background, and you can see the cars loaded. And so that was a car that they were leaving with. But as I said, it was the largest factory. And there's an ad from the 1920s. Watt Car Services Worldwide, the Watt Car and Wheel Company, Barnesville, Ohio. And then look down here, you're going to see all of the places that they have offices. There were like 8 different cities in the United States where they had offices selling their cars. That lasted until 1995, and I was, the Enterprise at the time was able to photograph the last men coming through those very doors when the factory closed. So there were other factories here as well. There was T&A Rogers Company, and T&A Rogers Company was located down where Village Hardware is now, but was originally called the Rogers Planing Mill. They made a lot of different products, including they had a patent on a kitchen table that's out at the museum. They made the North Star washer. They made porch swings. They made all kinds of things. And up here, this is the 1908 Barnesville Centennial Parade. Look at the log that's on that truck, T&A Rogers Lumber. The other one was Haig and Woodward. Smith Lumber Company later owned, this became Smith Lumber Company. But anyway, both of these were planing mills, and a lot of the houses that were built here, that's where the lumber came from, and that's where the finished lumber came from. So where did these guys live? Mr. Haig built this house for himself up on East South Street that's still there. This house over here was Mr. Woodward, his partner and half-brother. This was located at 216 North Chestnut Street until about a year and a half ago when the village of Barnesville decided to tear it down. So that was his house. And then the Rogers brothers had two houses, twin houses on North Chestnut Street. This is the rear of the house that Bob Ney once lived in, and you can see what it looks like today. And I was here in December, and the front door happened to be open on that Sunday, and of course you know me. I just stepped up, I didn't go in too far, but I did get a photograph of the stairway. But this, my friends, is what happens where I work in historic preservation. This is called demolition by neglect. And it takes two people to do demolition by neglect. One, the owner, and two, the municipality or city or county or whatever, by not enforcing their laws. So sadly, we're going to lose this one soon, so if you haven't photographed, do so. And this is the best of all of them. This is the Albanese house, which is the old, was the Rogers Robinson house. Tom Robinson, whose mother was a Rogers, lived there, and Mrs. Albanese lives there now, so that's a beautiful house there. Now, talk about Quakers. We're going to bring the Quakers back again. And I said the Quakers arrived at consensus. Not always. They split in 1826 or 27-28 between the Hicksites and the Orthodox. And then in the 1850s, they had another split, the Orthodox did, between the Gurneyites and the Wilburites. Those names came from the two men, Mr. Gurney and Mr. Wilbur, that they followed. And Barnesville ended up staying in the Wilbur camp. But they had a school in Mount Pleasant that was built in 1837, and they fought over control over it. So it went to court. And it went to court, and they found in favor of the Gurneys. It mysteriously burned a few days later to the ground. Nobody knows why or how it did. So, the Wilbur branch, the conservative branch today, came to Barnesville. Whoops, what did I just do? All right. Came to Barnesville, and they built this building here in 1878. It was 3 stories high. The boys' dorm was on one side, the girls' dorm was on the other, and the classrooms were on the 1st and 2nd floor, okay? Then, this is the school that was in Mount Pleasant that burnt in 1876. The school was actually built in 1876. If I said 1878, I'm wrong. And then in 1878, the conservative group came to Barnesville and built this, which is now called the Ohio Yearly Meeting House. And if you've been to Mount Pleasant, it's copied on the Mount Pleasant Meeting House that was built in 1814. It's a state memorial. And there is the school today. We'll talk about why it's 2 stories today as opposed to 3 stories back then. Then, kind of agriculturally related, but if any of you have ever been to Barnesville Memorial Park, this was originally the Barnesville Fairgrounds. And the Barnesville District Fair was established in 1870. And there's the, right there is the grandstand. There's the racetrack. It was a 1/3 of a mile racetrack. But it only ran from 1870 to 1892 when it closed. There were a few other buildings out there as well. This is the Barnesville Canning and Packing Company that was located on South Chestnut Street, peddling their products at the Barnesville Fair. And there's a couple of ads. Louise Cheppy had that one, and that one came out of the Barnesville Whetstone. But after the fair folded in 1892, then it was used for various purposes. In 1903, the village of Barnesville bought it, and it was renamed City Park. Now, mind you, Barnesville wasn't a city then. Barnesville's only been a city for a couple of days in its entire history. But anyway, every year then they would have the fall races, and they were very popular. In 1910, in the book that Mary showed you, I have a postcard. They had an aeroplane came here, and he did all of the flying around and everything, but he crashed. And several women fainted as a result of it. And I have a photo of the aftermath of that in the book, which was a postcard taken. And of course, they had to, dismantle the aeroplane and take it somewhere else. Anyway, that's the story of that. And of course, that's why Memorial Park is where it is today. In 1895, Barnesville had its most tragic fire, and it had a lot of towns had fires. But anyway, in 1895, January 12th to 13th, frigid, 30 below zero, if the thermometers were correct at that time, the fire started in this block here. This is today's Ohio Hills Health Center. It was built in 1891 by the Bradfield family. It was called the Bradfield Block. So this is only 4 years later. the Bradfields had the intelligence to put iron shutters on that side of the building. So when the fire started, they made sure they got the shutters closed so that the fire didn't get over and take that building as well. But it literally wiped out everything from that building up to the alley. You can see the new central block, which was built in 1886 here, that's still there today. The Enterprise was located right here in the gunning building. And of course, we lost all of the Enterprise files from May 28, 1866. This particular lithograph print here was in the Barnesville Republican the following week, which was one of the other papers. Also want to mention that this was the heyday. Everybody had to work a lot before the Civil War. It was all manual labor, but with all the inventions that came along after the Civil War, there was people in towns especially had some free time. These photos are all taken from the 1908 Centennial Parade, but it was the heyday of social and fraternal organizations. The Masons came here in 1827, the Oddfellows in 1851, and they built the new central block that I just showed you a minute ago. But let me give you the names of some of the other groups that were here in the fourth quarter of the 1800s. Grove of Druids, Wigwam of Red Men, Knights of Pythias, Order of the Mystic Knights of the Golden Eagle, Junior Order of the United American Mechanics, Modern Woodmen, the Maccabees, and they had the Lady Maccabees as well, Sons of Temperance, and then there was another group, because I'm going to get back and talk about racial aspects of it, only the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the Civil War veterans, and the women's group, the Women's Relief Corps, were integrated. And the men were integrated because they fought together in the Civil War against the southern states, and the women, of course, did as well. I didn't have a photo here, but I've got the women marching in the Barnesville Memorial Day Parade, and there's a black woman in the, probably in the second row, so I know that it was likewise integrated. Now, the African Americans of Barnesville also had a colored Oddfellows Lodge from 1884 to 1900. And today, if you've heard of Prince Hall Masons, that's an African American Masonic order, and they're all over in Washington, D.C. But anyway, they still exist. So, anyway, that was the heyday, and of course, today there aren't so many people and organizations like that. These are the public buildings at the time. This is the public school, the central school that was built in 1880. It was 3 stories high, and of course later that 3rd story was condemned in the 1940s, and that's why we had to build it. Well, even before that, we had to build the new high school in 1905, and then later the entire building. This was the city township building built in 1876, and there was a large meeting hall up on the 2nd floor. It met its demise in 1896 when it burnt to the ground. There's the Belmont County Children's Home, and most of us probably remember that. Well, with all the other activities going on in the eastern part of the county, or the central part of the county, why did the Children's Home get out there? Because they thought that the air would be better for the children. So, but anyway, it came out here. And then this photo down here I want to show you. You see, this is a public building too. This is the current site of the Barnesville Masonic Lodge on South Chestnut and Street. That was the African American elementary school from 1855, when the Barnesville Public Schools was established, until 1887, when the state of Ohio said, no more are we going to have segregated education. It's going to be integrated. There were 2 schools at Flat Rock, Captina, where I'm from. They had two schools as well. I think probably they were glad to be able to integrate because it was an additional expense. But this was after that time in 1887 when the Barnesville schools were integrated. Then this was turned into a residence, and it was torn down in 1938. So by the time of the turn of the century, Barnesville was really, really booming. In 1850, Barnesville had 750 people, and Morristown had 350, but Morristown was on the National Road. By 1900, Barnesville had 3,721 people, and Morristown had just. And so Barnesville, they did vote wet, and there was a state liquor store here in the bottom of the basement